"Where's Sheila?" Cammy asked me. It was sunset on the biggest night of the fair. Cammy and Guy and I were strolling along the hamlet sidewalk beside the gazebo. In the softball field to the north, a neon-lit Ferris wheel tinker-tonked above the voices of the crowds. A minute or so ago, the governor had stood beside the Ferris wheel and delivered a short speech, during which he had given Gene Horton the governor's Community Service Award. A large lump filled my throat, and I couldn't answer. "Mark, are you all right?" "He's okay." Guy punched me lightly on the shoulder. "Just let him alone." I found my voice, but it was about an octave higher than normal. "I guess we'd better get it over with." "I'll round people up," Guy said. "Cammy, you know what you have to do. Mother Brown's banquet room in a half an hour." "Thanks for coming here," I said. The large banquet room was dark except for a pool of light near the door. Beyond the door I could hear the sounds from the restaurant. But the five Hamlet adults seated in a half circle around Guy and me were deathly quiet. Mr. Craiglander, Mrs. Wong, and Mrs. Logan wore puzzled expressions. Mrs. Wentworth's eyes were watchful. Jean Horton looked dazed, and I could tell she'd been crying. "We won't keep you long," I promised. "We didn't call in all the merchants because not everybody has been as involved as you've been. But we wanted to fill you in on what's been happening at the hamlet. I'll be quick." "I'll be quicker," said Mr. Craiglander. "I've been hearing rumors. It was Sheila, wasn't it?" I nodded. Jean Horton lowered her head and began to cry. Mrs. Wong handed her a piece of tissue. "It's hard to know how to begin," I said. And at that instant the door opened and Cammy appeared. She looked back over her shoulder and paused. And then through the door came the Stanford family. First Mrs. Stanford, with pale face and downcast eyes, then a too casual Tony, and finally Sheila, with hot red spots in her cheeks and looking at no one. She seemed shrunken somehow. Jean Horton got up from her seat and moved over to put an arm around her, but Sheila pushed her gently away and came toward me. I pulled a chair over and she sat down. And funny as it sounds, in all the time I've admired Sheila, I never admired her more than at that moment. "First of all, I'm really sorry," she said in that same tiny voice she'd used when Guy and I found her in the passageway. "I've done a whole lot of stupid things." Mr. Craiglander flicked a glance at Cammy and then back at Sheila as if he were comparing the two girls. "I've got to tell you about it," Sheila said, and now there was a wobble in her voice. "You've got to hear why. What started it off was the name of Mrs. Wong's new store." Suddenly she could not speak. "Get a grip, Red," Tony said to his sister. Then he looked around at the rest of us. "You all probably know that our family had a rough time. What you don't know is that before we moved here, Mom worked at a place where they teased her about being poor. Her nickname is Polly. And there was this one supervisor who called her Poor Polly. She didn't mean anything by it, Tony," Mrs. Stanford said softly. "She did too," Sheila snarled. "Not as much as you think." Sheila's anger seemed to have burned away her grief for a while. Her voice got stronger. "I went back to visit Dad 2 or 3 weeks ago, and it brought back all the memories of the divorce and how we'd been so poor. And then I got back here and find out that 2 doors down from where Mom works is a place called Poor Polly's Pantry. I couldn't handle it. Tony nodded. Red always had a temper. Sheila ignored her brother. So just to get back at somebody, I switched the restroom signs. And then I got into the women's restroom and waited for a man to come in so I could scream. Mr. Craiglander's face went slack with horror. And then, he gasped, I came over and fixed the signs. And that's when I told you and Mark how I'd caught Tony throwing rocks onto the freeway. Only at that time I didn't know it was Tony. By the way, Tony said in a level voice, I never threw anything bigger than a marble. Mr. Craiglander swiveled his head around to stare at him. Then he looked back at Sheila. So I must have been the one who really started the ball rolling. She blushed a hard dark red. And then she said almost defiantly, I was glad I'd mixed up the restroom signs because that committee made Tony clean porta potty toilets for 100 hours. And I was mad at God too. So I bought a pack of computer paper and a $5 shareware banner program at the mall. And I used the center's computer to make that banner. I ran part of the practice banner to make sure it worked, and then tore it into tiny bits, and ran the final one and outlined it with a marker. And I came over early that morning and hung it on Agape. Shirley Logan, lips parted, brushed her fingers against her cheek, as though someone had slapped her there. In the same day I made the banner, Sheila continued, I found Mrs. Horton's purse in one of those barrels upstairs. While she was sorting, she must have set it close to the barrel, and it fell in without her noticing. She told me that she'd already stopped her Visa account and got a new driver's license. So I decided to hide the purse behind the plywood. But first I took all the money and the cards out and tossed them farther back into the passageway. I was so mad at God that I didn't want him to have the money right then, but I didn't want to spend it myself. What about the bench? Mr. Craiglander asked softly. Was that you too? Sheila nodded, her eyes on the floor. In those anonymous calls to the newspaper? She nodded again. I found a little piece of computer paper by the passageway door, I said. Must have stuck to your jeans earlier and got brushed off there. She stared at me. So that's how it matched with the banner, I said. And you were the one who took the banner from the trash bin, weren't you? She swallowed. It was you, Krug, who figured this all out? I shrugged. Me and Guy. How come you were up in that passageway when we found you? When Tony told me about the purse, I got scared. I glanced at Jean Horton. She looked at me helplessly. I kept my promise. Mark, I kept the purse hidden, but when Sheila and I went shopping that noon, I remembered I needed a department store credit card. I knew it was in the purse because I'd seen it after you found it. So I told Sheila to go out to the car and I'd be right there. And then I took down the purse and got the card. I must have left the purse on the counter. When Mrs. Horton told me about the purse, Sheila continued, I knew I had to get hold of the money. So I ran up there and got it. I figured I'd pretend that someone had donated it and give it to her. Mrs. Wong asked softly, Did you spray those gang symbols too? Sheila nodded miserably. I'm so sorry, everybody. I'm going to go to the counselor Mom goes to. He's going to help me work on my anger. But I went downstairs with you, Mrs. Horton, and when you weren't looking, I drew one of those gang graffiti things in a little notebook. I'm not as good as you, Krug, but I did the best I could. You were good enough, Molly Wong said quietly. And then I decided that my last thing would be to get back at Cammie's dad. I'm really sorry, Cammie. I'm really sorry, Mr. Craiglander. He looked sideways at her, almost like she was a rattlesnake. So I went into ye old bookstore to study up on witchcraft. I found some pictures and drew them on a piece of paper. And then, late one night, I drew them on Century Antiques with a big black marker Tony had found somewhere. Tony glanced at me. I raised my eyebrows. Mrs. Wentworth spoke for the first time. Sheila, I'm sure you realize that you've really caused us all a great deal of trouble. Yes, said Sheila meekly. No one knows how much revenue Country Hamlet might have lost if Mark and Guy had not discovered the truth. I know. No one knows what that downtown gang would have done if they had discovered someone was using its symbol. Dina Wentworth got to her feet. It seems to me, she said after a long pause, that what each of us needs to do is to put this far behind us. Tony, speaking for myself, I owe you a deep apology. I am very, very sorry. Mr. Craiglander cleared his throat. Me too. Tony stared at them for a moment, as if slowly tasting their words. Then he nodded. It's okay. Mrs. Wentworth looked at me. Mark, we owe you and Guy and Camilla a great deal of thanks. You have chosen to use your God-given talents to serve your community in several ways, including solving this mystery. You young people have a tremendous destiny ahead of you. And Sheila, she said it gently. Sheila gave the older woman one quick blue glance and then lowered her head again. I'm afraid that I'll have to terminate your employment here at Mother Brown's. Sheila squeezed her eyelids together tightly. I'd suggest that you spend your time working with your counselor and with Jean at the center. Sheila nodded, eyes still tightly shut. Mr. Craiglander cleared his throat. Now that that's settled, he said, I'd like to recommend we give Tony here a 3-week trial period as night security guard. What do you think, Dina? The landlady blinked, looked thoughtfully for a second or two, and then broke into a smile. On your recommendation, Bob, I think that would be acceptable. Then everyone sat there in silence for a moment. Nobody seemed to know where to go from there. Suddenly, Cammy spoke. What we need is a good game of Dutch Blitz. Mr. Craiglander frowned at his daughter. What's Dutch Blitz? I'll show you, she said. From the chair beside her, she picked up a little sack with Fun Shop written on it. I bought the game tonight. Come on, Sheila. Let's teach 'em.